Okay, let's get into this. Sometimes the places that really stick with you aren't the obvious ones, you know? They're the ones with like incredibly deep history, maybe amazing scenery, but also complex stories that mean they're not exactly on everyone's bucket list.
And it's interesting how sources sometimes describe places like that, which, despite, difficult pasts, are kind of looking to reconnect, often seeing something like tourism as a potential way forward.
Exactly. And that's really the ground we're covering in this deep dive. We're looking at Afghanistan, but specifically through the lens of one source we found called Journeying Through Afghanistan's Hidden Beauty.
Right.
And it presents a very particular view, focusing on its potential, maybe surprisingly for some, as a travel destination.
So our mission today really is to unpack what this source is telling us. What are its key arguments for why someone might even consider a visit? What places does it highlight?
And crucially, how does it talk about a modern service, FlightNHotels.com, as a tool to actually plan a trip like that?
Because the source does acknowledge the context. Afghanistan's turbulent history isn't ignored.
No, it mentions it up front, but then it pivots pretty quickly. It paints this picture of, unspoiled nature, really rich culture, and suggests trying to sort of reclaim a spot on the tourism map.
So we're essentially diving into the narrative this specific source builds for, anyone curious, maybe adventure seekers, history buffs, or just someone looking for something genuinely different.
Okay, so first things first. Why does this particular source argue that Afghanistan is worth considering for travel? It seems to build its case on a few core ideas. History is a big one.
Right, a huge one.
Yeah.
The source talks about it being this ancient land, like over 5,000 years of history. It frames it as this incredible crossroads, echoes of Alexander the Great, the Silk Road. It describes this legacy that's both grand and maybe a bit mystical. Ancient Buddhist sites, medieval Islamic architecture, that kind of thing.
And it's not just dusty history. The source also really pushes the natural beauty angle. Talks about, huge mountains, green valleys, these serene alpine lakes, even deserts.
Yeah, painting a picture of environmental diversity that might surprise people who perhaps only hold one image of the country.
Definitely. Another point the source really emphasizes, and this feels quite important, is Afghan hospitality.
Ah, yes.
It states pretty clearly that the culture really values guests.
Which, as the source suggests, could add this really personal, maybe quite moving dimension to a trip, beyond just seeing the sights.
For sure. And lastly, the cultural mix. The source notes there are numerous ethnic groups, each with their own languages, traditions, music, customs. It sounds like a place just layered with different stories.
So if you look at the source's argument overall, it's this blend. Deep history, striking natural beauty, that strong tradition of hospitality, and this rich cultural mosaic. That seems to be its foundation for saying, hey, consider this place, despite the challenges it also acknowledges.
Well, okay, so if that argument from the source catches your interest, where does it suggest you actually point your compass towards? It flags several key locations. Let's start with the likely entry point.
Kabul. It's presented as the capital, yes, but with a soul, trying to manage that mix of ancient history and modern development.
What does it suggest seeing there?
The source mentions exploring Baber's Garden. That's a restored 16th century garden, apparently quite beautiful. Also, the National Museum for the Historical Artifacts, and Darul Aman Palace.
Ah, yes, that striking ruin often seen in photos.
Exactly. The source describes it as a symbol of the country's resilience, which is quite powerful.
Then it moves on to Bamiyan. The source calls it the land of the Buddhas.
It does address the tragic destruction of the giant statues, obviously.
Really has to.
But it emphasizes that the valley itself, its historical weight, still inspires awe. And it's also where Afghanistan's first national park is located.
Bandi Amir National Park.
That's the one. Known for those incredibly blue lakes set against dramatic cliffs. So the source clearly positions Bamiyan as this mix of deep history and just stunning nature.
Next up in the source is Herat, often called the cultural capital.
Yeah, it highlights a strong Persian influence there in the art and architecture. Key sites mentioned are the Herat Citadel,
which dates back incredibly far, the source notes, to Alexander the Great's time.
Right. Amazing. And the Grand Friday Mosque, famous for its intricate blue tile work.
It's interesting how the source picks these places. Each seems to represent a different facet, the capital, the ancient spiritual center, the artistic hub.
Definitely seems curated to show breadth. And it doesn't stop at the major cities. It also points to places known more for rugged nature and their own historical significance, like the Panjshir Valley.
Described as nature's fortress in the source, surrounded by the Hindu Kush Mountains.
Yeah, it mentions its historical, strategic importance, but presents it now as offering a peaceful atmosphere.
And then way out, really remote, is the Wakhan Corridor.
The source calls that a remote paradise. It specifically flags it for serious trekkers, adventure travelers, people looking for truly untouched wilderness.
So it's clear the source isn't just focused on easily accessible sites. It actively includes these more challenging wild landscapes as part of Afghanistan's potential draw, shows the range it believes is on offer.
Exactly.
Now, planning. A trip to a destination like this, particularly one where the source itself brings up things like security protocols and limited direct flights, it needs careful logistical handling.
Absolutely.
And this is where, according to the source, FlightNHotels.com comes into the narrative.
Yes, the source introduces FlightNHotels.com not just as, another booking website, but positions it more as a potential travel partner for this kind of journey.
How so?
It presents it as a global online travel portal designed to make planning smoother, maybe more budget-friendly, and crucially, less hassle-filled, particularly given the potential complexities of arranging travel to this region.
It looks like the source emphasizes its usefulness by listing key functions. It mentions comparing flights globally.
Right, from various airlines, which, as you said, with limited direct routes, being able to find connecting flights easily would be pretty vital.
And booking hotels, thousands of options worldwide, it says, often with discounts.
And it also specifically mentions car rentals being available worldwide, including within Afghanistan itself, presenting that as a way to manage local transport once you're there.
Okay, and what about the practical assurances? Things like payment, ease of use?
The source highlights secure payment processing, instant confirmations, having a user-friendly interface for searching and booking, and the fact that it's available 24/7. The argument the source seems to be making is that tackling the planning for a destination like Afghanistan benefits from a comprehensive, reliable tool.
Right, a single place to handle flights, accommodation, maybe even getting around.
Exactly. Positioning FlightNHotels.com as that tool, aiming to provide more convenience and peace of mind, whatever your budget might be.
The source even lays out a sample 7-day itinerary. It looks quite ambitious, hopping between Kabul, Bamiyan, Herat, and Mazar-e-Sharif.
Yeah, it's quick.
But it explicitly recommends using FlightNHotels.com for booking those internal flights and hotels, framing it as a way to avoid last-minute problems.
It illustrates the source's point, I think.
Yeah.
That seeing multiple key spots is presented as feasible within a time frame like a week, implying that connections are there if you use the right planning tools.
Okay. And finally, the source doesn't just paint a rosy picture. It wraps up with some very practical tips for anyone thinking about this kind of trip.
Yes, very important ones. It stresses travel insurance is non-negotiable.
Absolutely essential, specifically mentioning coverage for medical issues and security contingencies.
And advising dressing modestly, as a sign of respect for local customs.
It also suggests hiring a local guide, which is framed not just for safety, but also to really deepen the cultural understanding you get from the trip.
Provides context.
And maybe the most crucial tip, the source urges travelers to stay constantly updated. Check official travel advisories, talk to local authorities before you go and while you're there.
And these tips, coming from the source itself, they do reinforce the idea that while it's presenting potential, it's not glossing over the need for thorough preparation and local awareness. It acknowledges the complexities it mentioned right at the start.
Definitely. Okay, so that brings us towards the end of this deep dive into the source, journeying through Afghanistan's hidden beauty. We've looked at its perspective on why someone might visit, focusing on that deep history, the unexpected natural beauty, Afghan hospitality, and the cultural richness.
We've run through the specific places the source highlights Kabul's blend of old and new, Bamiyan's historical weight in natural parks, Herat's cultural significance, Mazar-e-Sharif as a spiritual center, and then the rugged landscapes of Panjshir in the Wakhan Corridor.
And we examined how the source positions FlightNHotels.com within this picture. It's presented as this practical, potentially seamless, secure platform for managing the logistics of travel to a place like Afghanistan.
Detailing its features like global flight comparison, hotel booking, car rentals, secure payments, and round-the-clock availability. The source basically presents it as a key enabler for affordability and peace of mind, whether you're going to Afghanistan or really anywhere else.
So for you listening, our aim here was really to give you a distilled understanding of this particular source's viewpoint on traveling to Afghanistan, sticking closely to its claims, descriptions, and the services it mentions.
The source concludes by suggesting that Afghanistan, maybe still under the radar as it says, offers something authentic, something profoundly enriching for travelers who are willing to step off the more common tourist trails. It frames it as a country genuinely seeking positive attention for its unique character.
And that leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to chew on, building directly from the source's theme. It suggests Afghanistan is slowly, maybe tentatively, reappearing on the global tourism map. What does that actually mean? For a country with such a deeply complex, often painful recent past to re-engage with the world through tourism, and maybe flip that question too. How does the act of exploring these places, the source calls under the radar, or off the beaten path, how might that change both the person doing the traveling and the destination itself? It's something worth thinking about, as places with intricate histories navigate, opening up to the wider world.